Hello, dear listeners. Welcome back to our channel. If you believe that broken hearts can heal and that true love often finds us when we least expect it, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more romantic and emotional stories to life. Now close your eyes and let us transport you to the snowy, scandal-filled streets of Regency, London. The December wind howled through the opulent streets of Mayfair, carrying with it a bite that seemed to penetrate the very stone walls of the Everly townhouse. It was a cold that matched the frozen state of Lady Sophia Everly's heart, an organ that had been methodically shattered exactly 3 months prior. Inside the safety of her chamber, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that had become the household's permanent guest. The emerald gown laid out upon the bed was not merely a garment, it was a relic of a former life, a vibrant reminder of the woman Sophia had been before the scandal, a woman who believed in promises and the sanctity of betrothals. The facts of the betrayal were known to every soul in London's high society, whispered behind fans and discussed in the smoking rooms of gentlemen's clubs. It was a matter of public record that Lord Edmund Hartley, Sophia's intended, had been discovered in the conservatory of Lady Ashworth's estate, locked in a passionate embrace with Lydia Peyton. The betrayal was double-edged, cutting twice as deep because Lydia had been Sophia's closest confidant, a friend who knew every contour of Sophia's dreams, only to steal the man who starred in them. The narrative of that night had been rewritten 1,000 times by the gossip-mongers, turning Sophia from a respected Earl's daughter into an object of pitiable curiosity. Standing before her mirror, Sophia observed her reflection with the detachment of a coroner examining a stranger. The grey eyes that stared back were hardened, the spark of joy extinguished by the crushing weight of public humiliation. Her father, the Earl of Ashford, waited below, his own vitality drained by the scandal that had tainted his family's name. He had offered her the choice of seclusion, a retreat into the shadows where the whispers could not reach her. But Sophia had refused. To hide was to admit defeat. To retreat was to validate Edmund's cruelty. Tonight's dinner at the Westbrook residence was not a social engagement. It was a battlefield, and she intended to walk onto it with her head held high, armed with nothing but her pride and the emerald silk that reminded everyone of what she had lost. The journey to the Westbrook estate was a silent procession through the darkened streets of London. The carriage wheels rattled over the cobblestones, a rhythmic drumming that mimicked the anxious beating of a heart preparing for war. Upon arrival, the sensory assault was immediate. The residence blazed with candlelight, the sound of string instruments spilling out into the winter night. A stark contrast to the internal void Sophia felt. As the doors opened, the air inside shifted, the murmur of conversation faltered, then resumed with a frantic energy as dozens of pairs of eyes locked onto the new arrival. It was a gauntlet of scrutiny, a collective judgment passed in silence by the elite of the ton. And then, the inevitable confrontation with reality occurred. Across the drawing room, near the warmth of the grand fireplace, stood the architects of Sophia's misery. Edmund Hartley looked untouched by the havoc he had wreaked, his golden charm undiminished, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who had faced no consequences for his treachery. Beside him, Lydia Peyton glowed in pink silk, her hand resting possessively on his arm, a visual declaration of their impending union. The wedding was scheduled for January, a fact that loomed over Sophia like a sentencing date. Watching them, Sophia felt a physical blow, a hollowing out of her chest that nearly brought her to her knees, yet she remained standing, frozen in a tableau of dignified suffering. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the cloying scent of perfume and the heavy weight of unspoken pity. Sophia's father attempted to guide her toward a sympathetic group, but the need for escape was overwhelming. She drifted away, moving toward the periphery of the room, seeking the shadows where the glare of society's attention might be less blinding. It was there, near the frost-touched glass of the terrace doors, that she noticed she was not the only observer of the farce. Partially obscured by the heavy velvet drapes stood a figure that commanded attention, not by seeking it, but by actively repelling it. He was a man of imposing stature, broad-shouldered and dark-haired, with a countenance carved from the granite of the Scottish Highlands. This was William Deu, the Duke of Kingscote, a man whose reputation for reclusiveness was as legendary as his vast wealth. Facts about the Duke were scarce and often contradictory, but it was known that tragedy had struck him 3 years prior, the death of a young wife and a child, driving him from London to the isolation of his northern estates. His presence here was an anomaly, a disruption in the natural order of the season. Sophia observed him with a sudden, sharp curiosity. He stood apart from the crowd, his back rigid, his dark eyes scanning the room with a gaze that held profound displeasure and a weariness that resonated with her own exhausted soul. He looked like a man trapped in a cage of gilded bars, despising every second of his confinement. As if sensing her scrutiny, the Duke's gaze shifted, cutting through the intervening space to lock onto hers. In that brief, silent exchange, a current of recognition passed between them. It was not the spark of romance, but the grim acknowledgement of one survivor identifying another in a sea of blissful ignorance. They were both outcasts in this glittering room, one cast out by scandal, the other by grief. The suffocating atmosphere drove the Duke to turn abruptly and exit through the terrace doors into the biting cold. Without conscious thought, Sophia followed. The impulse was irrational, born of a desperate need to be near someone who understood the darkness she carried. The terrace was a landscape of ice and stone, the winter air biting through her silk gown, but the physical cold was a relief compared to the emotional stifling of the ballroom. The Duke stood at the balustrade, staring out into the darkness of the garden. He did not startle at her approach. His senses were evidently too sharp for that. Instead, he acknowledged her presence with a stillness that was almost predatory. When he finally turned, his assessment of her was devoid of the pity she had come to loathe. He saw the scars she hid behind her composure. He knew who she was, the jilted Everly girl, just as she knew he was the grieving widower. In the silence of the terrace, stripped of the pretense required indoors, a strange and dangerous conversation unfolded without the need for flowery pleasantries. He spoke of the suffocating nature of the event, of the vultures inside who fed on gossip and tragedy. She countered with the reality of her position, the necessity of enduring the season while her former betrothed paraded his happiness before her. The Duke listened, his demeanor grim, absorbing the details of her humiliation with a stoic intensity. He revealed his own plight, the pressure from his family to remarry, to re-enter society, to move past a grief that he still wore like a shroud. He was being hunted by matchmaking mothers just as she was being hunted by malicious gossips. It was in this crucible of shared misery that the idea formed, a calculated, strategic alignment of interests. It was not a proposal of marriage, but a proposal of war against the expectations of the ton. The Duke needing a shield against the relentless pursuit of eligible debutantes, and Sophia needing a weapon to silence the pity and prove she was not broken, found themselves staring at a mutually beneficial deception. If they were to feign an attachment, a courtship born of the season, it would solve both their dilemmas. The Duke's attention would elevate Sophia above the reach of gossip. No one mocked the woman courted by a duke, and Sophia's presence would grant the Duke the solitude he craved, keeping others at bay. The plan was audacious, fraught with the risk of scandal should the truth be discovered. It required them to navigate a minefield of social engagements, to perform intimacy where there was none, to convince the most cynical eyes in London that a spark had ignited between the icy widow and the jilted bride. Standing on that frozen terrace, the wind whipping around them, a pact was sealed in the shadows. It was a cold agreement, forged in desperation and strategic necessity with clear parameters, honesty between them, a united front in public, and a quiet, amicable separation when the season concluded. There was no mention of the heart, for both believed theirs to be damaged beyond repair. As they turned back toward the warmth and the lights of the Westbrook drawing room, the narrative had shifted. Sophia Everly was no longer the victim walking to her execution. She was a co-conspirator in a grand deception, walking back into the arena with the most powerful ally in London at her side. They stepped through the doors together, and the shockwave was instantaneous. Heads turned, conversations died, and the air crackled with a new electric tension. The game had begun, but neither the Duke nor Sophia could foresee that in playing the part of lovers, they were inviting forces far more dangerous than gossip to take root in the spaces between their lives. The true danger was not in being discovered, but in the possibility that the fiction might dangerously begin to resemble the truth. The transformation of Lady Sophia Everly's social standing was as immediate as it was intoxicating, a shift in the wind that left the entirety of London's high society scrambling to adjust their sails. The moment she had re-entered the Westbrook drawing room on the arm of the Duke of Kingscote, the narrative of her disgrace had been effectively paused, replaced by a sudden, ravenous curiosity. The pity that had clung to her like a shroud evaporated, replaced by the sharp, calculating gaze of a ton that could not comprehend how the season's most tragic victim had secured the attention of its most elusive prize. The air in the room had shifted from suffocating judgment to electric speculation, and as the evening wore on, the strategic brilliance of their alliance became apparent. Every polite nod from the Duke, every solicitous gesture he directed towards Sophia, served as a silent rebuke to those who had shunned her mere hours before. By the time the carriage returned her to the Everly townhouse that night, the rules of the game had fundamentally changed. The following morning brought tangible evidence that the deception was proceeding exactly as planned. A delivery arrived at the townhouse, a massive bouquet of winter roses that seemed to defy the season's barrenness, their crimson petals stark against the grey December light. The accompanying card bore no flowery declarations or poetic verses, only a single initial, W, scrawled in a bold, angular hand. It was a masterstroke of subtlety, a public gesture designed to be seen by the servants and whispered about in the kitchens, ensuring that the rumour of the Duke's interest would spread through the intricate network of London's domestic staff before noon. The strategy was clear: create a smokescreen so dense that no one would look closely enough to see there was no fire. By the afternoon, the deception escalated from floral tributes to physical presence. The arrival of the Duke's carriage at the Everly residence was a spectacle in itself, drawing the eyes of neighbours behind twitching curtains. His entrance into the house was a calculated invasion of Sophia's domestic sphere, a signal to her father and the household that this was not a fleeting fancy. In the drawing room, the performance continued under the watchful eyes of the Earl of Ashford. The Duke and Sophia sat together, ostensibly discussing literature and the arts, but in reality they were plotting the logistics of their campaign. They established the rules of engagement, the necessity of sustained eye contact, the strategic placement of a hand on an arm, the importance of appearing absorbed in one another to the exclusion of the world. It was a rehearsal for a play with the highest of stakes, where a single slip in character could result in social ruin. The true test of their fabricated courtship arrived 3 days later in the form of the Ashworth Christmas Ball. This was the premier event of the season, a gathering so significant that absence was tantamount to social suicide. It was here, amidst the evergreen garlands and the golden glow of hundreds of candles, that they would officially debut their alliance. Sophia prepared for the evening with the grim determination of a soldier armoring herself for battle. She chose a gown of silver. Silk, a deliberate departure from the muted tones of mourning she had favored since the scandal. The dress shimmered like moonlight on snow, cold and brilliant, a visual representation of the persona she was adopting, untouchable, radiant, and distant. When the Duke arrived to escort her, the approval in his eyes was the first crack in the professional barrier they had erected. It was a look of genuine appreciation that momentarily unsettled the careful equilibrium of their arrangement. A reminder that beneath the titles and the strategy, they were a man and a woman drawn together by shared scars. The journey to the ball was conducted in a tense silence, the air inside the carriage thick with the anticipation of the performance to come. They were about to walk into the lion's den, and the success of their entire scheme rested on their ability to convince a room full of skeptics that ice could burn. Their entrance at the Ashworth estate was a study in synchronized power. As the footman announced their names, the hum of conversation in the ballroom was severed as if by a blade. Hundreds of faces turned toward the grand staircase, eyes widening as they took in the sight of the reclusive Duke of Kingscote descending with the jilted Lady Sophia on his arm. The silence was not one of pity this time, but of stunned reverence. They moved through the crowd like a ship, parting water, the Duke's imposing physical presence creating a protective radius around Sophia that no one dared to breach. He was a formidable shield, his dark glare challenging anyone to utter a word of disrespect. The climax of the evening, and indeed the pivotal moment of their deception, came with the announcement of the waltz. In this conservative era, the waltz was still viewed with a mixture of fascination and scandal, a dance that required a physical intimacy, permissible only between those with an understanding. For a duke who had not danced in 3 years, a man who had publicly mourned the death of his wife with a monastic seclusion, to take the floor was a statement of earth-shattering proportions. When he extended his hand to Sophia, the gesture was not merely an invitation to dance, it was a public declaration of claim. As they stepped onto the floor, the other couples seemed to fade into the periphery. The Duke's hand settled on Sophia's waist with a firmness that was both possessive and reassuring, pulling her inches closer than propriety strictly dictated. It was a calculated breach of etiquette designed to fuel the gossip, but the effect on Sophia was immediate and visceral. As the orchestra swelled and they began to move, the performance began to bleed dangerously into reality. The Duke guided her with an effortless strength, his movements devoid of the hesitation one might expect from a recluse. He spun her through the turns, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization, a harmony that suggested a deep, intuitive connection rather than a rehearsal of steps. To the onlookers, the evidence was irrefutable. They saw the way the Duke's eyes remained locked on Sophia's face, ignoring the glittering crowd around them. They saw the flush on Sophia's cheeks, interpreted as the bloom of new love rather than the adrenaline of high-stakes deception. They saw a man who had returned from the dead for the sake of a woman who had been wronged. Even Edmund Hartley, watching from the sidelines with a thunderous expression, was forced to witness the spectacle of his former fiancée in the arms of a man who outranked him in title, wealth, and presence. The visible agitation of Sophia's ex-betrothed served only to sweeten the victory, a tangible proof that their strategy was inflicting the desired damage. However, within the circle of the waltz, a different and more dangerous narrative was unfolding. The physical proximity, the heat of the Duke's hand seeping through the silk of her gown, and the intensity of his gaze stripped away Sophia's defenses. In the swirling motion of the dance, the lines between the actor and the role began to blur. She found herself leaning into his strength, not just for the sake of the audience, but because it felt like the only solid thing in a world that had crumbled beneath her feet. The scent of sandalwood and the steady rhythm of his breathing became the only reality, the hundreds of watching eyes reducing to a meaningless blur. For the duration of that song, the lie ceased to feel like a lie. When the music finally ended, the spell was not broken immediately. They stood frozen in the center of the floor, chest to chest, breathing heavily, caught in a suspended moment where the pretense had vanished, leaving only a raw, terrifying attraction exposed. It took a supreme effort of will for the Duke to step back and resume the mask of polite formality, leading her off. The floor amidst a smattering of applause that sounded distant and surreal. They retreated to the terrace, the same terrace where their pact had been forged, seeking refuge from the suffocating heat of the ballroom and the weight of their own success. Out in the cold night air, stripped of the audience, the dynamic shifted again. The adrenaline of the performance gave way to a somber, heavy silence. The Duke's demeanor closed off, his expression hardening as he looked out over the snow-covered gardens. He spoke then of the past, offering a rare and painful glimpse into the tragedy that had shaped him. He recounted the death of his young wife, Margaret, and their child, laying bare the facts of his trauma with a clinical detachment that made the horror of it all the more palpable. He confessed that his heart was a graveyard, a place where love had gone to die, and that this arrangement was the only intimacy he could survive. A connection with a defined end, a safety mechanism to prevent the reopening of old wounds. Sophia listened to the recitation of his grief, the facts of his loss landing like stones in the quiet night. It was a warning, clear and brutal. Do not hope for more. He was offering her protection and a restoration of her dignity, but he was explicitly denying the possibility of a future. They were to be allies, friends, co-conspirators, but nothing more. Yet, as she stood there shivering in the winter wind, looking at the profile of the man who had just spun her through a waltz that felt like a dream, Sophia realized with a sinking heart that the warning had come too late. The deception had worked too well. It had fooled the ton, it had fooled her ex-fiancé, and in the dangerous, quiet spaces between their public acts, it had begun to fool her own heart. The terrified realization took root that she was no longer acting and that the man who claimed to be incapable of love was the only one she wanted to save. The days following the Ashworth ball dissolved into a strange, dreamlike cadence, where the distinction between performance and reality became increasingly difficult to discern. The strategic alliance, forged in the cold cynicism of a terrace pact, began to warp under the heat of genuine companionship. The weeks of December sped by in a flurry of social engagements, each one meticulously orchestrated to maintain the illusion of a blossoming courtship. Yet the actors found themselves forgetting their lines only to replace them with truths they had never intended to speak. They attended Lady Peyton's Yuletide soiree, sat together in the Duke's private box at the theatre, and were seen promenading in Hyde Park despite the biting winds. To the watching world, the narrative was clear. The icy Duke was thawing, and the jilted lady, Sophia, had successfully ensnared him. However, the true evolution of their relationship occurred not in the crowded ballrooms, but in the quiet, stolen hours within the Everly townhouse. The afternoon calls, initially established as strategy sessions to coordinate their public schedules, quickly transformed into something far more dangerous. Genuine connection. The Duke, a man who had famously shunned society for its vapidity, found in Sophia a mind that matched his own in sharpness and depth. They moved past the superficial pleasantries of the ton to discuss matters that were typically barred from drawing-room conversation. He spoke of his vast estates in the Highlands, detailing the agricultural reforms he implemented and the lives of the tenants he felt personally responsible for. She, in turn, revealed the secret ambitions she had buried beneath the expectations of her gender, her desire for university, her hunger for history and philosophy, and her frustration with a world that valued her embroidery over her intellect. It was in these moments that the danger manifested. The Duke did not dismiss her dreams as fanciful, nor did he offer the condescending platitudes common to men of his station. Instead, he engaged with her ideas, challenging her arguments and respecting her intellect with a seriousness that was more seductive than any compliment. He revealed that his late wife Margaret had possessed a similar hunger for knowledge, a revelation that served as both a bridge between them and a reminder of the ghost that still haunted him. The intimacy of these conversations was profound, stripping away the layers of social armor they both wore. They discovered a shared sense of humor, a dry, sardonic wit that allowed them to communicate in a shorthand that baffled onlookers. At the theater, they spent less time watching the melodramatic actors and more time whispering critiques that left them both shaking with suppressed laughter. It was a companionship that felt effortless, a terrifying contrast to the laborious formality of their supposed arrangement. The tipping point arrived on a snowy afternoon in the library of the Everly home. The house was quiet, the heavy snowfall outside muffling the sounds of the city, creating a sensation of isolation that bound them together in the firelit room. Sophia was sketching, the scratch of charcoal on paper the only sound, while the Duke read nearby. The domesticity of the scene was an illusion, yet it felt more substantial than the entirety of Sophia's previous engagement to Edmund. As she sketched his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the furrow of his brow, she realized with a sudden, sinking clarity that the pretense had completely evaporated. She was no longer acting the part of a woman. Intrigued, she was a woman in love with a man who had explicitly warned her against such foolishness. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The Duke looked up, catching the intensity of her gaze, and the comfortable silence shattered. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air, that they were no longer two strangers hiding behind a convenient lie, but two souls who had accidentally found a home in one another. Sophia, emboldened by the quiet and the sheer weight of her feelings, ventured to bridge the gap. She challenged the boundaries of their agreement, suggesting that perhaps the protection they offered each other had evolved into something real. She posited that the arrangement need not be temporary, that the friendship they had built was a foundation strong enough to withstand the ghosts of the past. The reaction was immediate and defensive. The Duke's walls, which had been slowly lowered over the past weeks, slammed back into place with a deafening finality. The suggestion that he might be capable of moving on, of risking his heart again, triggered a panic born of deep-seated trauma. He retreated into the fortress of his grief, using his status as a widower as a shield to deflect her hope. He spoke of survival as a choice that precluded living, articulating a philosophy of emotional asceticism, where the only way to avoid pain was to avoid feeling altogether. He rejected the possibility of a future, not because he did not desire it, but because the terror of repeating his history paralyzed him. The conversation in the library quickly devolved from a tender exchange into a confrontation of ideologies. Sophia accused him of cowardice, of hiding behind his loss to avoid the terrifying work of healing. She challenged his assertion that he was protecting her, arguing that his refusal to live was a greater cruelty than any risk of heartbreak. He, in turn, lashed out with the precision of a man who knows exactly where to strike, reminding her of the terms of their pact, of the temporary nature of their alliance, and of his own brokenness. He painted himself as a vessel too damaged to hold the love she offered, a man whose capacity for joy had been buried 3 years ago. The argument was a collision of her hope against his fear, and fear, being the older and more entrenched emotion, won the day. The Duke departed the library with a formality that was more painful than anger. He retreated not just from the room, but from the intimacy they had cultivated. The days that followed were marked by a silence that was deafening. The daily visits ceased, replaced by brief impersonal notes coordinating their final appearances of the season. The warmth that had begun to thaw the Duke's demeanor vanished, replaced by the icy reserve that had defined him before. Their meeting, he was pulling away, preparing for the inevitable separation, severing the ties before they could knot any tighter. For Sophia, the withdrawal was a devastation, unlike the scandal with Edmund. That had been a betrayal of trust. This was the loss of a possibility. She was left alone in the townhouse, the echo of their laughter in the library haunting her. She realized that she had committed the cardinal sin of their arrangement. She had fallen in love with a man who was fighting a war against his own heart. The pretense continued in public. They still attended the necessary functions, still stood side by side, but the electric connection was gone, replaced by a brittle tension that threatened to snap at any moment. Lady Catherine, Sophia's mother, observed the change with a maternal intuition that missed nothing. She saw the way Sophia's eyes followed the Duke when he wasn't looking, the way her daughter's spirit seemed to dim when he departed. She recognized the signs of a heart that was not merely mending, but breaking. Anew, the realization that Sophia was alone in this affection, that the Duke was actively resisting the bond, added a layer of tragedy to the household. The festive preparations for Christmas continued around them, the hanging of holly, the planning of menus. But for Sophia, the season had lost its color. She was facing the prospect of the new year, the deadline of their agreement, and the return of the Duke to his Highland solitude. As Christmas Eve approached, the tension reached a critical mass. The final act of their performance was looming, and the reality of the impending separation settled over Sophia like a physical weight. The Duke was effectively ghosting her while standing right beside her, a torture that was exquisite in its cruelty. The fragility of their pretense had been exposed. It could not sustain the weight of genuine emotion. The structure they had built to protect themselves was now collapsing, threatening to bury them both in the rubble of unspoken words and unrequited love. The question remained whether the Duke would retreat fully into the safety of his isolation, or if the cracks in his armor were fatal enough to let the light in. The stage was set for a final confrontation, not of anger, but of truth, as the clock ticked down toward a holiday meant for families and futures, things the Duke had sworn he would never claim again. The arrival of Christmas Eve brought a heavy, suffocating silence to the Everly townhouse, a stark contrast to the festive chaos that had consumed the rest of London. Outside, the snow fell with a relentless determination, blanketing the city in white and muffling the sounds of carriages and carolers. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken resignations. The house was dressed for celebration. Evergreen boughs draped over mantels, the scent of beeswax and spiced oranges permeating the air, and the traditional kissing bough hung with hopeful precision, but the spirit of the holiday was notably absent. For Lady Sophia, the date marked not a beginning, but an ending. The countdown to the new year was no longer a promise of renewal, but a ticking clock signaling the expiration of the arrangement that had become her lifeline. The Duke had effectively vanished from her life in the days following their confrontation in the library, leaving a void that felt far more expansive than the space he physically occupied. His absence was a loud, brutal confirmation of his refusal to bridge the gap between their fabricated courtship and the terrifying reality of genuine affection. Sophia moved through the motions of the holiday obligations with a numbness that alarmed her parents, her thoughts constantly drifting to the townhouse across the city where a man sat in a fortress of his own making, protecting a heart that was already broken. As the evening deepened and the family prepared for a somber, intimate dinner, the rhythm of the night was shattered by an urgent, unexpected pounding at the main entrance. The disruption was a severe breach of protocol. Christmas Eve was a time for family, not for social calls, and certainly not at an hour when respectable households were turning inward. The butler, Henderson, moved to answer the summons with a mixture of irritation and curiosity, his composure tested by the irregularity of the event. When the heavy oak doors swung open, the figure standing on the threshold brought a gust of freezing wind and a shock of recognition that rippled through the household. It was the Duke of Kingscote. He stood framed by the swirling snow, his appearance a stark departure from his usual immaculate presentation. His greatcoat was dusted with white, his boots were wet, and his chest heaved as though he had traversed the distance from his own home on foot, driven by a desperation that overrode all considerations of propriety or comfort. He did not wait to be announced, he simply entered, bringing the storm in with him. The raw intensity of his presence stripped the room of its formal pretenses. He was not there as a duke paying a social call. He was a man who had reached the absolute limit of his endurance. Sophia rose from her seat, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the sight of him. The man who stood before her was not the guarded, cynical strategist she had met on the terrace. The walls he had so carefully constructed, the defenses built of grief, sarcasm and distance, had been leveled. In his hands, he clutched a small, velvet-wrapped object with a grip so tight. His knuckles were white, holding onto it as if it were the only anchor in a turbulent sea. The silence that stretched between them was heavy with everything that had been left unsaid in the library, but the air was no longer charged with rejection. It was vibrating with a terrifying, desperate hope. Without the preamble of polite greetings, the Duke crossed the room, his focus narrowing until the rest of the world, Sophia's parents, the servants, the festive decorations, ceased to exist. He began to speak, his voice rough and unpolished, discarding the carefully measured tones of the aristocracy for the jagged honesty of a confession. He admitted to the deception he had been practicing, not the public ruse of their courtship, but the private lie he had told himself. He confessed that he had spent the days of their separation in a solitary hell, attempting to convince himself that his withdrawal was an act of nobility, a sacrifice made to protect Sophia from the wreckage of his past. However, the solitude he had once prized had turned on him. In the silence of his empty home, the truth had become undeniable. The safety he sought in isolation was nothing more than a slow death. He revealed that the terror of loving again, of risking the agony of another loss, was indeed paralyzing, but it had been eclipsed by a new, more potent fear, the prospect of a future without her. He articulated the realization that surviving was not enough, that the half-life he had been living since Margaret's death was no longer sustainable after having tasted the vitality Sophia brought into his world. The moment of surrender was absolute. The Duke dropped to one knee, a gesture of humility and supplication that sent a shockwave through the room. He unwrapped the velvet package to reveal a ring of profound significance, a massive sapphire encircled by diamonds, an heirloom that had belonged to his mother, a piece of jewelry that spoke of history, lineage, and a future that he had previously sworn he would never claim. The proposal that followed was not a request for a strategic alliance or a continuation of their arrangement. It was a plea for salvation. He asked her to be his wife in truth, to share the burden of his past and the uncertainty of his future, offering her the only thing he had left to give. A heart that was scarred, yes, but beating entirely for her. The acceptance was immediate and emotional. There was no need for coquetry or hesitation. The pretense had been burned away by the raw honesty of his confession. As Sophia accepted the ring, the shift in the room was palpable. The tragedy that had defined the Duke for 3 years was effectively ended, replaced by a fragile but undeniable new beginning. The embrace that followed was a public sealing of a private covenant, witnessed by her parents who quietly withdrew, recognizing that the drama playing out before them had transcended the bounds of a mere courtship. The news of the engagement broke the following morning, on Christmas Day, creating a sensation that rippled through London with the force of a tidal wave. The timing, the history of the couple, and the sheer romance of the gesture captured the public imagination completely. The narrative of Lady Sophia, the jilted girl left for her best friend, was rewritten overnight into a fairy tale of redemption. She was no longer the victim. She was the triumphant heroine who had thawed the heart of the Ice Duke. The Everly townhouse was besieged by well-wishers, the very people who had whispered behind their hands weeks ago, now clamouring to offer their congratulations, eager to be associated with the season's most celebrated match. Yet, amidst the flurry of victory, one final ghost from the past arrived to test the strength of their new reality. 2 days after the engagement was announced, Lord Edmund Hartley appeared at the Everly residence. His arrival was met with a protective hostility from the Duke, who positioned himself as a physical barrier between his fiancée and the man who had humiliated her. The tension in the room was razor-sharp, the air thick with the potential for violence or further scandal. However, Edmund had not come to fight, nor to plead for a return to the past. He had come to offer the one thing Sophia had never received: the truth. Standing before the couple, looking diminished and weary, Edmund stripped away the facade of the callous libertine to reveal the desperate, weak man beneath. He laid out the facts of his betrayal, exposing the financial ruin that had threatened his family estate. He explained that his father had faced destitution and that the marriage to Lydia Peyton, whose dowry was substantial enough to settle the debts, was a transaction forced upon him. He admitted that he had allowed the world to believe he was driven by lust and fickleness because it was easier, then admitting he was a coward who had sold his happiness for solvency. The revelation changed the complexion of the past 3 months. It did not excuse the cruelty of the act, nor the public manner of the betrayal, but it removed the sting of personal inadequacy that Sophia had carried. She had not been left because she was lacking. She had been collateral damage in a financial negotiation. Edmund's apology was clumsy but sincere, driven by the realization of what he had destroyed. He confessed that seeing Sophia with the Duke, seeing her valued, protected, and genuinely loved, had forced him to confront the magnitude of his own failure. The reaction to this confession was the final severance of the cord that bound Sophia to her past. She did not feel anger, nor did she feel the satisfaction of revenge. Instead, she felt a profound indifference, a lightness that confirmed she had truly moved on. With the Duke's hand firm and warm in hers, she offered Edmund a forgiveness that was not for his benefit, but for her own peace. She thanked him, a statement that confused him until she clarified the sentiment. His cowardice had set her free. By breaking her heart, he had inadvertently created the space for it to be healed by a man who understood its true value. As Edmund departed, closing the door on the chapter of her life defined by scandal, Sophia and the Duke were left standing in the quiet of the morning room. The external conflicts had been resolved. The society that had judged them was now celebrating them. The ex-fiancé who had haunted them was now a pitiable footnote. All that remained was the future, a vast, unwritten expanse that lay before them, leading away from the crowded ballrooms of London toward the wild, open beauty of the Scottish Highlands. The Christmas miracle was not that they had fooled the world, but that in the process of the deception, they had accidentally saved each other. The wedding of the Duke of Kingscote to Lady Sophia Everly took place 3 weeks into the new year, a ceremony defined not by the pomp and circumstance, typical of the season's premier match, but by a quiet, fierce intimacy. It was held at St. George's, attended only by the immediate families and a handful of confidants, a deliberate exclusion of the society that had so eagerly consumed their earlier misfortunes. The vows exchanged were not merely legal formalities, but the ratification of the pact. Made in the snow on Christmas Eve, when the deed was done, there was no grand reception, no parade through the streets of Mayfair. Instead, the newlyweds boarded a carriage bound for the north almost immediately, fleeing the suffocating embrace of London with the urgency of escapees. As the city's spires faded into the grey horizon, the final tether to their old lives snapped, leaving them drifting toward a future that remained unwritten and wild. The journey to Scotland was a physical transition that mirrored their internal metamorphosis. As the manicured hedgerows of England gave way to the rugged, untamed moors of the borderlands, the polished veneer of the Duke began to crack, further revealing the man beneath the title. The landscape grew harsher, the wind colder, and the sky vaster. For Sophia, this was an entry into the unknown. She was travelling to a place that had claimed the life of William's first wife, a land of stone and storms that required a resilience she had not yet tested. Yet, as the carriage wound its way through the mountain passes, passing lochs that mirrored the steel-grey sky, she felt a strange sense of recognition. This stark beauty, stripped of artifice, resonated with the honesty they had found in one another. Castle Kingscote rose from the mist like a natural extension of the granite cliffs it stood upon. It was a fortress, ancient and imposing, built to withstand sieges and storms rather than to host tea parties. The air here was thin and sharp, smelling of peat smoke and pine. To the servants who lined the courtyard to greet them, the arrival of a new duchess was a matter of trepidation. The castle had been a place of mourning for 3 years, a mausoleum dedicated to the memory of the dead. However, as Sophia stepped onto the cobblestones, wrapped in furs against the biting wind, she did not shrink from the gloom. She entered the great hall not as an intruder, but as a force of vitality, ordering fires to be lit in hearths that had long gone cold, and throwing open shutters to let the pale winter light wash over the stone. The months that followed were a period of quiet reconstruction. The Duke, back on his ancestral land, shed the last remnants of his London armour. He spent his days riding the boundaries of his estate, managing the tenant farms and overseeing the land with a diligence that commanded respect. Sophia, contrary to the fears of the household staff, did not wilt in the isolation. She found a profound freedom in the Highlands. She rode with her husband across the heather-covered moors, returning with wind-flushed cheeks and mud on her boots. She reorganized the castle's vast, neglected library, turning it into the heart of their home, where they spent long evenings reading and debating by the fire. The ghosts that William had feared would haunt them seemed to retreat into the shadows, banished by the sound of laughter in the corridors and the living warmth of their marriage. However, the shadow of the past had not vanished entirely. It was merely waiting. The arrival of spring brought with it the news that Sophia was with child. It should have been a moment of unmitigated joy. the securing of the succession and the ultimate symbol of their union. Instead, the revelation struck the castle with the force of a thunderclap. For William, the news was a resurrection of his deepest trauma. The parallel was terrifyingly exact: a beloved wife, a remote castle, a pregnancy that carried the weight of history. The joy in his eyes was instantly eclipsed by a primal, suffocating fear. He began to govern Sophia's life with a frantic protectiveness, restricting her movements and watching her with the desperate intensity of a man guarding a candle in a gale. The summer passed in a haze of tension. The castle, which had begun to feel like a home, transformed back into a fortress, this time against the invisible threat of mortality. Every storm that lashed the windows, every day that shortened as autumn approached, seemed to ratchet up the anxiety. The Duke spent sleepless nights pacing the corridors, haunted by the memory of the silence that had followed Margaret's labour. He brought in the finest physicians from Edinburgh, stationing them in the village weeks in advance, taking precautions that bordered on the obsessive. Sophia bore his fear with patience, understanding that he was not seeing her, but the ghost of the tragedy that had nearly destroyed him. She remained the calm center of the storm, insisting on her health and the difference of this narrative, even as her own apprehension grew with the swelling of her belly. The climax of this agonizing wait arrived, poetically and cruelly, in December, exactly 1 year after they had first met in the frosty air of the Westbrook Ball. A blizzard descended upon the Highlands, sealing the castle off from the world in a wall of white. The roads became impassable, the wind howled around the stone towers like a banshee, and amidst the fury of the elements, Sophia's labour began. The timing felt like a test from fate, a deliberate recreation of the conditions of the Duke's nightmare. The physician was present, but the isolation was absolute. There would be no help coming from the outside. They were alone with the outcome. The hours that followed were an endurance test that stripped away all rank and pretense. The Duke was banished to the hallway, where he stood guard like a sentinel, listening to the sounds of pain emanating from the chamber, sounds that tore at his sanity. He was forced to confront the helplessness that had broken him 3 years prior, the terrifying reality that all his power, wealth, and strength could not influence the battle being fought behind the closed door. The storm outside raged in sympathy, rattling the window panes and burying the castle in drifts, creating a sensory overload of chaos and noise. It was a long, brutal night, where the past and present collided, the spectre of death hovering close in the candlelight. Then, just as the storm began to break in the pre-dawn grey, the silence of the aftermath was shattered, not by a cry of grief, but by the thin, indignant wail of a new life. The sound pierced through the Duke's paralysis. When the door finally opened, he entered the room with the hesitation of a man approaching a holy sight. The scene that awaited him was not one of tragedy, but of exhaustion and triumph. Sophia lay pale but alive, cradling a bundle that contained the future. The fear that had ruled William's life for so long finally shattered, breaking apart under the weight of the reality before him. His wife was breathing, his son was crying, and the curse of the past was broken. They named the boy Thomas. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere of Castle Kingscote shifted permanently. The fear that had permeated the stone walls evaporated, replaced by the chaotic, demanding joy of a nursery. The Duke, once the austere recluse who preferred sheep to people, was frequently found in the nursery, holding his hair with a reverence that softened the hard lines of his face. The healing that had begun with a deceptive waltz in London was completed in the quiet nursery of a Highland castle. They had survived the winter, both literally and metaphorically, 5 years. Later, the landscape of their lives had settled into a portrait of enduring happiness. The castle was no longer a fortress against the world, but a sanctuary for a growing family. On a crisp winter afternoon, the courtyard echoed with the shrieks of children. Thomas, now a sturdy boy of 5, led a chaotic snowball fight against his younger sister, Catherine, while their parents watched from the periphery. The Duke stood with his arm around Sophia, his chin resting on the top of her head, watching the scene with a contentment that would have been unrecognizable to the man he was 5 years ago. The snow fell softly, covering the tracks of their past struggles. They had built a life on. The foundation of a lie that turned out to be the only truth that mattered. The convenient arrangement had evolved into a bond that had withstood scandal, grief, and the terror of loss. Standing there, wrapped in the warmth of her husband's embrace, Sophia reflected on the circular nature of their journey. They had started in the snow, 2 strangers looking for a shield against the world, and they had ended in the snow, lovers who had become each other's world. The pretenses were long gone, the masks discarded, leaving only the enduring reality of a love that had dared to bloom in the dead of winter. The story that began with a whisper in the shadows had found its voice in the laughter of children and the quiet, unbreakable peace of a promise kept. Thank you for journeying with us through this tale of romance and redemption. If you were captivated by Sophia and William's story, please leave a like and subscribe for more captivating narratives. Your next adventure awaits in the video appearing on your screen now. Click to discover another secret waiting to be told.